Well, I think those are very good observations, and definitely services are the future. I think several of the ambassador pointed it out. I think George also pointed it out.
Yes.
Really, and what we're seeing, where we're seeing Indonesia move quickly, is in the new sectors, which are not well regulated and not overly regulated, I should say, and they don't. There's not much presence of state-owned enterprises. And this is not a coincidence. This is what has held Indonesia back in the manufacturing space. It's held it back in the infrastructure space. It's one reason Indonesia doesn't have large private sector construction companies and so on. So the areas that are moving quickly are the ones that are furthest from the SOEs. And I think that's a fact that has to be stated. The SOEs are a burden on Indonesia. They serve a social purpose, and that has to be defined and I think more clearly discussed and articulated in general society. But what we're seeing, the services, because they don't have big capital, they're not interesting to government, they don't need government, and this is where education is so important because services only takes one or two smart people, and that's where education comes in. So I think we really are on the right track by opening up the services more, by opening up education and healthcare, which are fundamentally you need an intelligent, healthy people, really to have a successful economy, and to the extent that foreign investment can accelerate that movement, Indonesia benefits greatly. So I hope we can stay away from this emotional, old-fashioned, too many foreigners taking advantage of Indonesia, and look at the contribution that global finance and that global skills and global personnel can give to any country. No country can go it alone in today's world. All the large economies are attracting more and more foreigners to work in the key sectors. So I think Indonesia, if it can relax with the confidence that however big the foreign sector gets, it's still a small sector in a big economy. And however many foreign expats we have working in technical areas, working in management areas, there's still a small portion, and we all learn from each other. So I think if we can do that, we can really, Indonesia can accelerate because it will grow at 4 to 5%, I think, for once we return to more normal economic circumstances. But it won't reach the 6, 7% potential that is there, and it's still there unless it really develops its human resources, mobilizes capital in a more productive way, and helps everybody move forward. So I think we've touched on a couple of very good areas. And again, I'm very impressed that this government, the first government in the 40 years I've been in Indonesia, that's really said we have to compete. Our education is substandard. Our healthcare is substandard. We need investment. We benefit from investment. It benefits all Indonesians. So I think this is a very encouraging sign. I hope we can avoid all the political noise that these sentiments sometimes generate. And I hope the government works on its communication skills and doesn't just send messages and say, here's it, we figured it out, here's a good way to do it. They need to communicate better how these things benefit the majority of Indonesians. If they can do that, we can really move forward at a greater pace, recover from COVID as quickly as possible, and then get back on a much better track. So I'm very, very encouraged by the discussion today. I'm very encouraged by many of the things that the government's doing.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I think the Jokowi government has actually many times surprised us, right? Initially, when he first came in, everybody thought that he would be a lame duck president in the sense that he would be cobbled by the PDIP and Megawati, but he showed himself to be a man that could stand his own ground. And now, in his second term, he's really opening up again. And like you said, there's an appreciation of the problems and the weakness within the Indonesian system and the economy. I want to move on a little bit here. Something that has been buzzing around over the past few days, and I'd like to get the views of the panel on this, and maybe starting with Jim. is the issue of the sovereign fund again. Indonesia wants to launch I think it's a $2 billion sovereign fund, and is looking for investors to come into the sovereign fund. And from what I understand, it would be invested in SOEs, but you just mentioned the SOEs are a drag. You know, should the government actually kind of, you know, stay away from these things, because yeah, it's distractive, and I don't know, you know, there's not much confidence in them actually having a well-run sovereign fund.
It's called a sovereign wealth fund, but that's a brand. They're using it as a brand name. It's a new function for a sovereign wealth fund. You know, initially these were things where countries like Norway that had excess capital used it to invest in basically capital markets and bonds around the world. It was a grand savings fund. It wasn't to invest and spend in infrastructure. This is a development fund. And people who invest in it will see that, and it's just a question if the Indonesian government can offer the terms, the conditions, and the confidence that this money is an investment, because historically, I mean, government investment in infrastructure has been what we call a loss leader.
Yes.
It doesn't generate enough money to pay for it directly by fees, but if you build a road, it's good for society. Whether people pay back user fees and so on is a different question, but it helps society. So this won't work for a sovereign wealth fund. They're going to look at it. I mean, if they're investors, if it's not an aid program, if it's really an investment program, then they're going to look at the return. And the problem with this kind of investment in infrastructure is you have foreign currency and domestic rupiah revenue. So unless you get some kind of a currency guarantee or a currency, you know, take a currency insurance, there's a lot of risk involved. This happened, of course, with the IPPs, the independent power producers, in 1998. It was one thing to pay 8 cents a kilowatt hour when the rupiah was 2,000 to the dollar. It was another thing when the rupiah was 14,000 to the dollar. And this is why Indonesia has not been able to get too much private investment, foreign private investment infrastructure, because of the currency mismatch. So the fund is going to run into this difficulty, and how they deal with it, I'm not sure. But it's not a sovereign wealth fund in the traditional sense. It's really an investment fund in domestic infrastructure. And I think a lot of the countries that have stood up to say they're in so far, it's more of a political statement than an economic statement. So we'll have to see what the real terms and conditions are, how the money flows, and most importantly, what kind of transparency the process will have. Because this will be, again, if it's not an aid program, then we're going to have some interesting developments. So I'm a little bit concerned that it's been overhyped, and it's a lot more difficult to implement, I think, than we'd like to believe.